Great. Okay, so we are now recording. So today we are going to be going over how to use FirePro user permissions, and that's going to include how to set up user profiles, how user licenses work, how to monitor and work with the administration level user, how to set up details of specific profiles and why you might want to set things on profiles, how the various different permissions work, and also how to set things like global settings. So we're going to go over things in quite a bit of detail. If people have specific questions, please pop questions into the chat, because that way I can see and answer those questions. So we are going to get started pretty much straight off here. I'm going to give it just one more minute, and then we will go ahead and get going on that. If there are some specific things that you'd really like me to cover related to this stuff, make sure you just pop a note into the chat, and I can make sure that that those particular things are covered. Although I expect we're going to be going over things in even a bit more detail than most people are aware of. Okay, so if I see any additional people join, I will pop them into the meeting right away. But without any much more ado, we'll go ahead and make those changes. So let's not draw on the screen if we can help it. So what we're going to do here today is start by talking about how user licenses work in FirePro in general. So if I go in and take a look at my user setup in the program, and you can access this in a couple of different ways. The simplest way to do it is just gonna getting a lot of background noise, so I'm just gonna mute to make sure everybody's muted. You do have an option to unmute yourself, but it is nice to put a note in the chat if you're gonna do that. So the system is going to allow us, if we go to the home page, there's a button in the top right-hand corner called About FP2. There's also in the File menu an option called About FirePro. This takes us to the same place. It's this little pop-up window that tells you information about your FirePro system. You're going to see in the bottom right-hand corner there your number of licenses. This is how many total user licenses people have for FirePro. The way that user licenses work with the program is that user licenses allow concurrent access to the program. So a standard FirePro system has no limit on the number of computers that you can install FirePro on. It has no limit on the number of user profiles that you set up for different users. The only thing that it has any limitations on is people can use the system at the same time based on the number of licenses that they have. And if you have too many people logged in, the system will send a message really quickly on there. So the system's gonna let you see how many user licenses you have, and it's also going to go ahead and let you see how many people are logged in. If you want to take a look at how many people are logged into your FirePro system, you can go to the File menu, select the option called Logged In Users, and it's going to show you exactly who is logged in to FirePro currently. That's going to show their login date, their username, their computer IP address that they're logged in under. If you want to, you can use this function to terminate a logged in user. That will log them out. Be aware that any unsaved work will not be saved in that scenario. So it's something you only want to use if you have a user who's logged in there. One thing I should point out there is that if you see a user called FP maintenance in that list, don't log that out. That is FirePro doing some internal work. We use an FP maintenance user for that. We're not doing any work directly. It's an automated task that's running from your local machine. So when we're talking about user profiles, each user profile that's logged into the system is going to use up one of your user licenses while that person is logged in. Now, there's two different kinds of user permissions. that we have in here are our user profile packages. So if we go to the setup menu, there's an option called administrator options, and there's an option called user options passwords. So the administrator option is for the administration or admin level user. There's one user profile in all of your FirePro systems that have administrator level permissions by default. You can always tell what that is by when you go to the login screen. The first login on the list with the little star next to it is the administrator login. That's the one that automatically has full permission to do everything, full control over everything in the system. So that's going to be your default. The default username for that is Fire Chief, but you can always modify that if you want to. If you want to change things about the administrator or the admin level user, you can go to the setup menu and go to the option called administrator options. Now, I should point out that the administrator options menu is only available to the admin user. So you need to be able to get into that to see this. If you can't get into the admin user, contact us. We can provide you with a temporary password to get into the admin user if you need that for some reason. But under administrator options, we can see we can set the administrator username. We can change the administrator password if we want to, and we can attach the administrator login to a specific personnel record if we would like to do that. It's certainly an option. You don't have to if you don't want to, but if you do have a specific user within the program who is acting as the administrator, then linking them to the personnel record is not a bad idea. The primary station is also going to be something that you can set for the administrator. Whenever we see primary station throughout the user profiles, what primary station means is that this is going to be the default station that's set when this user adds new records. And generally, it's only something that you need to set for the station that an individual person is assigned to. It's fine to leave the administrator user with no primary station or primary squad, because often that profile kind of works throughout the entire program. So the administrator login, again, can be modified in the setup menu under administrator options. It's usually a good idea with a relatively new FirePro system to go in and change the default administrator password as soon as is practical. So, because we send that with a specific one that's set up for your department, but it's always good to change it as necessary. So the administrator login is going to be one that attaches to your entire FirePro system. And we have other user profiles that you can set up in the program. As I said before, you can set up as many user profiles as you'd like. You can build new user profiles in the option under setup menu in user options passwords. So all a user profile is a permissions package and user password for FirePro. These do not represent any kind of data in the system that you have to keep. So you can always go in and delete user profiles, add new user profiles. You will not lose any information whatsoever if you delete these. If you change a user profile, like this is an existing user profile that's attached to stuff, I could change this to something else, for example. And what's going to happen is that the system will give you a message right away. Do you want to change all creator names to something else? Normally, I would recommend saying no here. The reason for this is that when you are logged in with a user profile, FirePro keeps track of the things that you do while you're logged in. So for example, it keeps track of records you created. It keeps track of changes you made. There is a fairly extensive piece of auditing software that's built into the program via the audit module. And the audit module tracks, let's see. longer time period. So the audit module tracks all kinds of changes that are made throughout the program. And when it tracks that information, it uses the user profile information that's logged in to keep track of exactly, I might have gone a little too long on that time period. It's going to keep track of exactly what changes each individual user has made throughout the program. So you have the option in that scenario of running searches to see exactly who's made what changes in various different parts of FirePro. If you go in and change a user profile, so for example, if I go in and change a user profile name on here, if you say yes to the message that pops up there, it will change all the historical records for that user profile regarding what they created and things like that. So normally my recommendation is create new user profiles for people rather than change existing ones. The other thing we want to remember, though, is all that auditing information is saved in the software separately from the user profile. So if this person is no longer with the department, you don't need this user profile any longer, you can just go in and delete this. It will not impact any of the historical auditing data. There's no problem deleting this. The only time you have to be careful is if you're changing an existing user profile. So let's say that I want to create a new user profile for a new user in the program. In order to do that, I need to go to the Setup menu, go to the option called User Options Passwords, and we can see here there's two tabs in this window. There's the Users tab, which lists all the different user profiles that I currently have set up. And there's a Roles tab, which deals with creating standard permission packages. If you are a larger department, you have a relatively large number of users or a relatively large amount of user turnover, I generally recommend using user roles. We'll go over how to use roles today. But the users function allows us to create individual user profiles. So if I want to create a new user profile, I can use the green plus button here, and that's going to create a new blank user profile for me that I can then start to fill out. So when I am creating a new user profile, didn't see people in the waiting room. When I go in to create a new user profile, the first thing that I can do on there is I can attach this user profile to a personnel record. I don't have to do this though, it's not mandatory. So sometimes you're going to have FirePro users who are, say, administrators, for example, or other members or employees of the municipality who need access to FirePro for certain reasons, but they're not necessarily in as a personnel record. You don't have to link these to a personnel record. You can leave this blank and just manually put in any name you want in here, and it will create a user profile for them. However, if you are giving access to a member of the department, it's a good idea to link this personnel record to their user profile because it allows some information to flow back and forth automatically in terms of things like who is this person an officer of, or what areas has this person attached themselves to. So it's going to give you a little bit more permissions. It will automatically bring over the profile name. You don't have to keep that. You can always modify the user profile name. All this is going to do is keep track of this is the login here. If we're using roles, we can select a role. We don't have roles set up yet, so we don't want to put it in. I can put in any kind of password I want. I should remember that the password is case sensitive, but we don't enforce rules for complexity on the passwords. There's plenty of password complexity out there, so you can use whatever you want in there. It is important to remember that when you are putting in your initial password, you hit the tab key to create the secondary password, and then it'll show you the second password. If you want to show it, it'll let you see it so that you can check to make sure that those are both accurate. There is a tick box here called priority user. Priority user allows you to set up multiple different tiers of passwords. I normally only recommend priority user in very specific circumstances, usually for things like departments that have integrated dispatch, where they want dispatchers to have guaranteed access to FirePro, or when there's certain members of the department that require access to the system at all times versus other users who might not, based on the number of licenses. So generally, we will recommend that you use the priority user checkbox. I'm going to show you how to use it today, but I normally don't recommend it, except in specific circumstances. So under this, the first thing that we're going to see on a user profile is this station tab, which has view permissions for stations and for platoons or squads. So normally we want to determine for an individual user, does this person need to see everything throughout the entire program, or do they just need to see information from specific stations, potentially ones that they are associated with? These might be departments, depending on how your FirePro system is set up. But this overall permission is going to be what's allowing you to see specific things throughout the program. From a technical support perspective, we often get questions where someone will say, this user can see stuff in FirePro, and then this other user cannot see those things. 99% of the time, that problem relates to viewing permissions, especially related to station viewing permissions. Because what this means is if I set this user profile up so that it can only see stuff that's attached to station 60, that means any record anywhere that's attached to a different station will not be visible to this person. So these, the station view permissions and potentially the squad view permissions kind of provide an overriding filter that controls what a user is going to see throughout the entire program. We layer individual module permissions on top of that, but this is kind of the most fundamental way of setting permissions. So you usually want to determine what stations does this person need to see information about, and you can use the check all functions to do that. It works the same way with squads, crews, or platoons. If your department doesn't usually use things like squads or platoons, you might not see anything in here. Broadly speaking, it's usually simplest to add all permissions, all squads to users, unless you are set up in a say more of a composite or a full-time scenario where you want individual shift captains to be able to see their own stuff, in which case you can set it up so they can only view their own shift information. That is also something that you would normally want to coordinate with us on, because there's some things about crews and squads and where they show up that also need to be thought about. All right, so broadly speaking, in this case, we're going to set it up so that all the permissions are available for all the stations for this user. And then we're going to go along to the modules 1 and modules 2 tabs. So modules 1 and modules 2 are where you can set up the individual modules that each user has access to. So you can decide on a per user basis specifically which modules you want them to be able to see information about and what level of permissions you want those users to have within that module. So view allows you to see records in the module at all. If you want someone to just have access to this module and be able to see records, view permission is all you need to give them. If they want to add or change or delete records, then those permissions are important in there. The edit list permission is one that I normally give out with a fair degree of caution. And the reason for that is that the drop-down lists throughout FirePro are a shared resource, which means that their contents are shared by every user. So if someone makes changes to those, those changes will impact potentially the entire system. So I tend to only give edit list permissions to specific users that I'm comfortable, understand how the list permission structures work. The administration login always has the ability to edit lists in every module, but give the edit list permission out with a degree of caution. There's an export capability. This allows you to export bulk data into spreadsheets. Normally, it's, again, more of an administrator level permission if I have somebody who's going to be needing to do bulk or heavy duty reporting. Officer status is a permission that allows users to make changes to records that have been locked or closed. So in a lot of modules, you have the ability to lock down records. For example, in the case of incident reports, I can take an incident report and flag it as closed, which means that at that point it is locked for access and no one can make editing changes to that incident unless they have the officer status flag turned on. Basically saying this user is allowed to make changes to locked or closed reports. So again, it's something that you want to consider carefully who you want to give officer status permission to in specific modules. However, these permissions are module based, so you can have someone who does not have officer status in incident reports, for example, but does have officer status in inspections because you want them to be able to, say, modify a closed inspection as necessary due to their role as an inspector. There is also a permission here called management reports. Management reports allows you to run the higher level, more detailed reporting in an individual module. So this is going to say, okay, this person can run top level reports for inspections, for example. But viewing permissions will always allow a user to print the basic detail reports on individual records that they can see, for example. Individual modules will also have their own sort of additional sub permissions depending on the specific module that we're dealing with. So the properties module has, for example, the ability to not allow a user to make changes to properties in general, but the edit contacts function would allow that user to update the contact files attached to properties. This would be if you don't want them to adjust the main files, but you can populate owner and occupant, for example. Likewise, you could have a limitation here where a user can make some changes to property records, but can't edit the core addresses on property records because you want those to be consistent with, say, the ones from your municipal tax data, for example. The properties module has a few additional permissions, the personnel module has a few additional permissions as well. One important one there is what we call view private info. So with user personnel records, individual personnel records, we tier the personnel records into two different levels of information. What we would consider public information, which is things like basic address, some attendance information, versus private info, which is normally going to be, say, tabs that have things like driver's license numbers, social insurance numbers, personal health numbers, or health information is considered the private info section. So generally, we would only want to ensure that senior staff or administration level staff have this view private info function turned on. You can also set a person or an individual user profile to be one record only viewing in the personnel module. What that means is that this user profile can only see the personnel record that they are attached to. So in this case, you could let a user access their own personnel file to see things like attendance histories or detailed information on their personnel file. It also, if you give someone, say, editing permissions in there, they could then add their own notes to their personnel record, upload links if they want to be documenting things for themselves in their own personnel file. So the one record only gives limited access to the personnel module for that individual user. There's a few other areas where modules will have some additional permission structures. Bylaw, for example, does give users the ability to potentially make changes to the bylaw setup. But most of the modules have the standard permissions other than those two big ones. So you can set up for each person a fairly detailed set of permission module level access. The other thing that you generally want to do is look at what we call the other permissions on a user profile. The other permissions most of the time are higher level permissions which allow a user to be more like an administrator or more like the admin user than a regular sort of standard FirePro user. So the other tab includes things like the ability to make changes to the fire code, the ability to make changes to the street names in the properties module. Access to the setup menu gives users access to the FirePro customization tools that allow you to modify how the system works. Again, generally something you only want to give to an administration level user. There's also the user options menu. This allows the person to come in and make changes to user profiles. So this essentially comes close to making someone an administration level user. There's also access to the maintenance menu. The maintenance menu is where you can make large-scale changes to FirePro's data contents. Once again, generally something you only want to provide to administration level users throughout the program. The data utilities permission gives the user access to this file data utilities menu. This is where you can do things like make backups of the program, create training databases, send error logs. It is, broadly speaking, an administration level permission. The logged in user list is something you might want to give to users who are not administrators. That allows them to access this file logged in users menu that we were looking at earlier, where I can see which users are logged in at any given time. Again, access to this menu does also give people access to the terminate user button. So you might want to consider whether it's appropriate for each individual person. If you have modules like the inventory service scanning tool, where you can use integrated barcode scanners for servicing or for incident attendance or training attendance, you can give the user profile permission to do this. There's also a delete pictures and links function in here. This allows you to delete photos and link records that are attached to files. We normally don't allow that by default, just because it is certainly possible to accidentally delete things that you might want in there. Finally, one of the other permissions here is the run OFC or OFM, depending on what your province is, transfer option. This allows this user profile to actually go in and run uploads for the provincial government for provincial reporting. So if you want someone to have that level of permission, you can give that to them. Now, if I have, say, a secondary user on here that has very similar permissions to the one that I've got set up, one of the things that I might want to do is I can copy these user profiles. So if I use this duplicate button, which is this little white button up at the top here, I can make an exact copy of the current user profile, say assign it to a different person, put in the new name, change to a new password, and now I have another user profile in here that has the same characteristics as the previous one, but is set up as a new user profile. Doing a duplicate tends to be what I recommend rather than editing an existing user profile, because then I could go back in here and delete this user profile in the system. So I have the new person in with the exact same characteristics as the previous profile. Now, if you're in a situation where you have a fairly large number of users or a fairly high turnover for users, what you may want to do is set up user roles. User roles can be set up through the same window in the tab called Roles. So in this case, I can create a new role. I'll say Captain. And I can then go in, set what permission levels I want for that user role for modules 1 and modules 2. And once I save that, it becomes available when I am creating new user profiles. So I can create a new user profile. I can assign it to a person. I can give it the captain role, and that person will automatically get all the permissions that we set for captain in modules 1 and modules 2. You still do need to set station view permissions and what we would call other permissions manually when you're using the roles. Mainly this is because these permissions tend to be very user specific as opposed to being more generic. So you could also use the duplicate function in there. One of the nice things about having the role set up, though, is that if you have a number of roles, say you've got a half a dozen captains that are assigned to the captain role, and you want to quickly go in and modify what captains can see, you could go into the roles tab, modify the captain role, and once you save this, it'll ask you, do you want to update the module permissions for all those users that are in the role? And if I say yes, then when I go back to the individual captains, I can see that those new permissions have been added to all the user profiles. So it can be a quick way of allowing you to quickly update the permissions for a larger group of people. Roles can be very handy if you need to quickly deploy a large number of permissions or different user packages as well. So when I have user profiles set up, there are a number of things that I can do on those user profiles that I might want to do in terms of a slightly specialty things. So the first thing is that when I have a user logged in the system, each individual user profile has under the file menu an option called preferences. So these are preferences that are just attached to that individual user's profile. So I can say, for example, this user profile, we get the startup menu, we get the incident module automatically. The report preferences allow you to set for this user profile exactly where on the screen or on the printed page prints appear. The email allows you to set a reply email for that user. And window settings allow you to do things like window scaling, or if I want to really change quite a bit in the way of large scale fonts and colors, I can modify that in here as well. So say, for example, I'm wanting to modify my buttons. I can go in and tabs, buttons, say I want that to be 10 or 11. It will, interesting, system doesn't have a 10, so I can apply that and it's going to modify all my button fonts for an individual user. Another thing that happens with individual users is that users can have what we call saved searches set up or saved lists set up. So if I go in and I wanted to have, for example, a specific list template which included inspection information, updated date, stuff like that, I can right click on here and say set save as my list template. So you can set a list template, but what you can also do is if you right click on a window as an administrator user, you can do things like set global default searches. So global defaults are going to apply to every single individual user profile in the system, which allows you to make large-scale changes to all users in terms of some of the defaults. If that's something you're interested in, let us know. We can walk you through that in a little bit more detail. But that's something that is applied and relates to each individual user profile throughout the system. So when we are working with user profiles, frequently we're going to want to make sure that those user profiles are appropriate to the individual roles of a person. If necessary, if their role changes, you can go in and modify their user profile to expand it. If a person leaves the department, it's no problem whatsoever to just go in and delete their user profile. All the information related to auditing and what they've done throughout the program will remain. And these user profiles, while they can be attached to personnel records, are not actually personnel records. So deleting them will not impact any of that information. So let's talk briefly about using the priority user flag. So when you have FirePro user licenses, in this case, this system has 5 user licenses. What that means is that any 5 user profiles can be logged in and working in the system at the same time. But say you're in a situation where you have 2 primary administration staff who are in the program constantly, and then a rotating cast of many other people who might or might not be in FirePro, but aren't in on a regular basis. So what you want to do is say, I want to set it up so that the 2 users who are always in the system can always log in, regardless of how many other people might be in the system. And I want all the rest of the users to share those other 3 user licenses. So what I can do is I can go to the setup menu under custom settings, and I can go to the other tab. And in the other tab, there is a section here where it says number of priority users and total number of licenses. So in this scenario, I could say, I would like to take 2 of my licenses and assign them as priority users. So what you're saying is 2 of the 5 licenses are only available to user profiles that are flagged as priority users. So now what I've got is 2 tiers of licenses, my 2 priorities and my 3 remaining from my total. So if I go in now and go to my user options passwords, I can set specific users as priority users, which means they will use the assigned priority licenses as opposed to the regular pool of licenses. So this allows you to split your larger license pool into smaller sections and designate these users work from this pool of licenses and these users work from a different pool of licenses. So that's how the priority user function works. Normally it's for something like a dispatcher who there needs to be at least 1 dispatcher on at all times. So you set all the dispatchers with priority users and then assign 1 priority user license, which means there's sort of a queued out separate license for dispatchers, for example. So the user profiles throughout the system, pretty common, something you're probably going to be doing quite a bit. Like I said, very frequently, if there's issues with what people can see, then the view permissions here are the main issue. There is another, so broadly speaking, my recommendation is that each individual user should have their own user profile attached to their own name set up. The reason for this is that the auditing system provides, let's just see if my auditing search has completed over here. Yeah, so the auditing system provides a fairly detailed breakdown of when changes were made and what changes were made throughout the program. So for example, it's going to show me exactly what user made changes for all these audit adjustments, which means that if you have actual names of people associated with this, you have transparency into what people are doing. If you're using a generic login like Station 1, you have no way of knowing who from Station 1 was logged in and doing this. So I normally don't recommend generic logins. However, there are some scenarios where having a generic login can be useful. One very good example of this is, say, for example, I'm using the inventory service scanning for using a barcode scanner to do service logging. The service scanner actually lets you track for each person who's using it at the time. So in order to make things simple for members of the department, what you could do is go in, set up a scanner login, give it a generic password that's easy for people to remember, and then just give the user permission to do the inventory service scanning, for example. So this is a very simple user profile that anybody can quickly log in and use. So for example, in this case, if I go in and I use my scanner login, the scanner login does not have a wide range of things that it's available to do, but I can say add my inventory service scanner to the barcode setup, and I could even go into my preferences and say that the inventory service barcode pops up automatically. What this will do is when a user logs in to do the barcode scanning, they just get, and then they can just enter their personnel ID. I don't have anything memorized, so that's not going to let me do it, but they can then just enter their barcode, their personal ID number, and start scanning. So there are some times when a more generic login can be really useful, but in most cases, I don't recommend it because it doesn't give you detailed auditing information about what users are getting up to. Okay, so we've gotten to the point where I've covered most of the topics that I wanted to talk about, but it's now usually a good time to have people ask questions. If you want to unmute, ask questions. If you want to put questions in the chat, we can go over anything specific related to this topic that you'd like to cover. Well, I did get at least one chat message in the chat, so I'm pretty sure it's working. But that looks like we don't have a ton of questions in there. Hopefully that means that I covered the things we needed to cover. Now, of course, that being said, if you have any follow-up questions on this topic, or you want a little bit more detailed training, or you have some specific things you want to deal with for your department, please feel free to contact us through technical support. Diego can answer any standard questions, or we can set up any kind of online training. So once again, this session is being recorded. It's going to be available on the website, usually within about a week, if you wanted to go over any factor or any part of it. Got a message. Okay, one second. Great. Okay, so that would be all for everybody today. Thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate it. And yeah, we're going to have another one of these in a couple of weeks if people are interested in some of the other topics. Really appreciate you all taking the time today. Yeah, the administrator. So Charlie, the administrator does not have to be attached to a personnel record. In fact, no user profile has to be attached to a personnel record. So you can set up profiles for anybody that you want. Again, with the administrator, if you're going to leave the administrator profile as a relatively generic profile in the sense that maybe multiple people might have access to it, it's a good idea to remember that you're doing that because it will affect things like auditing level permissions, but it's not a requirement, no. Okay. Super. Well, thank you all for your time today. Drop me an email if you have any further questions. Really appreciate